Superpowers is a topic you often study in year 13, and it always goes hand in hand with globalization in paper 2 exam. Okay, so I'm going to go through what you need to know for superpowers, and then I'm going to go through every section of the specification to help you understand the overview of what you are taught and what you need to know for your exam. Okay, so the first thing you need to know is that superpowers are defined according to a number of characteristics. On the whole, we tend to see about 6 or 7, and they range from cultural beliefs to resources to population to physical size, etc. Okay, you also have to understand the pattern of dominance has changed over time. So we've gone from a unilateral world, a unipolar world where we had one hegemonic superpower like British Empire or at times the USA, to a bipolar world in the Cold War where we had the USA versus USSR by for two, to a multipolar, which is a bit what we have now with we've got the US, we've got we've got the EU, we've got China, we've got rise of major emerging superpowers. Um, that leads to each superpower has its own sphere of influence, the area that it wants to dominate. So think of the South China Sea for China, think about the Eastern Europe for Russia, think about the Americas for the USA. And that it means there's some massive political tensions, and we have some geopolitical implications with it. Okay, so inquiry question one, we have to look at what are superpowers and how have they changed over time, and that's where we talk about the different categories. So we've got economic, political, military, cultural, demographic, natural resources. We talk about the difference between hard and soft power, hard being aggressive power, soft being subtle power. So military versus film, for instance. We look at different types of theories, the Mackinder hinterland theory. We have a look at the change of uni, bi, and multipolars. So we look at British empires, we look at the Cold War, we look at the rise of emerging superpowers. And when we look at the range of superpowers, so emerging superpowers vary in the influence. We look at the BRIC economies, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China. A term from Goldman Sachs. We look at the G20. We look at the mint economies, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. We have a look at rising blocks like Asian, etc. We have a look at different development theories such as the world system theory, dependency theory, Rostow's model of development of growth, and we understand the kind of different aspects. So the key case studies you need to know for inquiry question one are Russia and China, a good example of hard power, aggressive, kind of coercive type of power. The USA, example of hard with its military, obviously, and soft through TNCs. EU is a good example. It doesn't have an army really, so it's better at soft power. The USSR is for the Cold War, example of bipolar. Unipolar was British Empire, and the Mint and the BRICS economies, which are the NEs that are rising, is a big section of 7.3. Okay, that's the key thing. You need to understand what is superpower for 7.1. The different how superpowers have changed over time, 7.2, and the rise of new powers and the different theories involved with it for linked to development in 7.3. Okay. Inquiry question two. We're looking at what impact superpowers have had on the global economy, political system, and the environment. So the first one, we look at how superpowers have influence over the global economic system, and we look at IGOs, which are international government organizations, IMF, World Trade Organizations, World Economic Forum, the OECD, the World Bank, the UN, etc. We have a look at TNCs, public and state-led. So think of the likes of, I don't know, Apple and EDF in France. We have a look at global rise of westernization, food media. Think of things like McDonaldization. We look at Hollywood, etc. Then we have a look at 7.5. We look at superpowers, emerging nations, and the key role in decision making. So that would include the role of countries as global police. The USA is a good example. We have a look at all alliances. So one of them is NATO. We've heard a lot about it with everyone in Ukraine. The only one you have to stay up to date, it's probably the topic where you have to stay the most up to date of the whole A level, because ANZUS doesn't really exist anymore. With New Zealand withdrew from the treaty, so we now have Australia, the UK, and the USA, and it's called AUKUS. But it's replaced ANZUS really, but it's a military alliance. We've got economic alliances like the EU, that NAFTA again, that's been scrapped under Donald Trump. It's been replaced by the USMCA, USA, Mexico, Canada agreement. Asian, IPCC for the environment. We look at the Security Council, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, and the like. Okay, and then we have a look at global concerns about the impact. So we look at the role of superpowers in the online environment. So we think of the impact of of these big organizations, big countries on use of fossil fuel, carbon emissions, environmental degradation, etc. Okay, so ultimately the IGOs you need to know of mainly are the UN, World Trade Organization, IMF, I've got WTO twice actually. World Bank. TNCs are transnational corporations operating in more than one countries, and alliances. You've got a few examples here. Okay, and in core question 3, there you have to learn about the sphere of influence of each of these superpowers and what are the implications. The implications as these superpowers want to actively be involved in the sphere of influence because they are so close to them. They feel threatened within those spheres. Okay, so the first one is global influence is contested in a number of different spheres. We have a look at the Arctic oil and gas exploration. So Arctic is a massive tension between the countries within the Arctic Circle. So Russia, Canada, the US with Alaska, and the Scandinavian countries. We look at TNCs there and intellectual property rights. We have a look at Russia and Western Europe, Eastern Europe. So we have a look at China and the South China Sea. We also then have a look in 7.8 section of the specification, which is development. Developing nations have a changing relationship with superpowers and the environment. We look at the Middle East. We look at India and China. We have a look at China's investment in Africa as a continent and African nations. And then we finish off with existing superpowers face a challenge to their power. So we look at economic problems linked to being a superpower. We look at the uncertainty to the future, the rise of the multipolar world, the rise of China in essence. So the kind of cases and examples we discussed there are the Arctic and its resources, the South China Sea for China, the EU and Russia's conflicts, the Chinese investment, foreign direct investment or FDI in Africa. We then have a look at the Middle East, things like Arab cultural ideologies led to the Arab Spring. We look at Libya over there, what happened with Colonel Gaddafi, and we have a look at how superpower status of the USA is being challenged by the rise of other powers such as China. Okay, and ultimately to finish off, some of the skills the examiners expect you to be able to use, not exclusively, but they expect you to know is because they'll expect you to analyze complex data that include power rankings of development, of military capabilities, etc. They'll expect you to be able to map past, present, future spheres of influence and analyze those. They'll expect you to use graphs of world trade and logarithmic scales that expect you to be able to understand maps of emissions and resource consumption and proportional symbols as to which countries emit the most, etc. They expect you to understand the world's economic center of gravity does change over time because of the different poles or uni, bi, or multipolars, and then expect you to understand data such as GDP, gross domestic product, and from different sources, analyze why these sources might have conflicting data, etc. Okay, hopefully that gives you a good summary of what you need to know. This is just a very bare bone summary. You need to know the detail for each of these parts of the specification. This hopefully gives you a good overview.